Commissioner, Chairman, taxation as a concept hasn't really changed very much, has it, in the last 3,000 years? The rich and the powerful stealing money from ordinary people to make their own lives more comfortable. Where there has been a change in modern times is that taxation is for the benefit of the taxed, that somehow we are being taxed pro bono. In order to perpetrate this myth, we invent periodic scares to frighten people into submission. The latest of these scares is, of course, that if we don't cough up green taxes, we will all boil to death. Reminiscent of the medieval religions, isn't it, which played the same game: pay up or burn in hell. Tax harmonisation is a concept dreamed up by the modern political class to make sure that no government steals too little from its people. A sort of thieves' cartel, if you will. May I suggest that if you really want tax harmonisation, that the Commission and the bureaucracy pay the same taxes as the electorate. They bear the same burden as tax as the rest of us before the electorate storm this building and hang us from the rafters, as they've every right to do.
For the FD Group, Mr. Bloom, 2 minutes.
I'm a baby boomer. I was born just after the war. We've probably had the longest period of peace and prosperity globally, I would say, from that time. I've put a little bit of modest money away so I can hand something down to my family when I pass on, largely because I've never spent more money than I've earned, and I've been prudent, and I've worked moderately hard. Now, it always seems to me as a complete surprise to politicians how countries get in debt. Let me explain, because I don't think you really understand it. It's because politicians consistently spend more money than they raise in taxation, more money than they can possibly raise in taxation, most of which, in point of fact, they actually waste. The reason we're talking about countries which are broke, and they are broke, is because their ridiculous, ineffective, ignorant politicians consistently spend more money than they can raise, and then they borrow, and worse, they then print money, because politicians and their central banks have a machine which prints money. You do that as a private citizen, and it's a criminal offence. You would go to prison for doing that, and politicians and their central banks do it all the time. Let me explain to you that these countries are broke, and they're broke because of their own stupid leadership and politicians, and it's immoral to ask ordinary taxpayers of any country to pick up the tab for failed politicians and failed banks. They are defaulted, they're broke. For God's sake, let's all of us admit it.
Mr. Bloom? Yes, well, thank you very much. Mr. Goebbels is brandishing his blue card.
You accept the question? Mr. Goebbels, 30 seconds.
President, I'd like to know if Mr. Bloom knows that Spain is less in debt than the UK, that Ireland was under 60% before the banking crisis, and that Ireland, in going to debt to save its banks, saved the money of the British banks.
absolutely right. Absolutely right. I wasn't suggesting my politicians were any less stupid than anybody else. It's an absolute disgrace. And it wasn't even debated in our national parliament to actually rescue these bust banks. If you want to invest in bust banks, do so with your own money, not money from my old age pensioners in Yorkshire on 98 quid a week. You scoundrels.
And now, on behalf of the EFD, we have Godfrey Bloom.
Mr. President, in the 1970s, the Community Reinvestment Act in the United States made due diligence in banking illegal. To pursue a political goal, the administration laid open the pathway to what we now know as subprime debt. It proved, as I said it would at the time, a pathway to hell paved with good intentions. It was conceived to make banks lend to people who could not possibly repay. We politicians now love to blame the banks, but it started with politics. Sadly, politicians do not understand money. How else could we have got ourselves into this appalling mess? Yet we've learnt nothing. We are now advocating a form of Eurobond, a subprime debt instrument by any other name. Again, we are bailing out the banks at the expense of the taxpayer. The ECB, Bank of England and the Fed are all at it. Print money, give it to the banks to buy junk bonds, bogusly rated as AA, to shore up their reserves and guarantee salaries and bonuses that ordinary people can only wonder at. We have learnt nothing from the 2008 crisis. We are desperately clinging to a failed political ideal as our cities riot and burn. The day must surely come when politicians, bureaucrats and central bankers must be called to account by a fiscal crimes tribunal and sent to prison for a very long time.
Mr. Bloom has 2 minutes.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They are broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money. And yet we blame the real retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
Grazie per il...
EFD for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Godfrey Bloom.
President, Commissioner, not for the first time I rise to give you the benefit of my 35 years' experience in financial services, I suspect rather more than the rest of you put together. Let me put you right on how this all started. It started with something called the Community Reinvestment Act in America. And the reason the whole thing has gone wrong is because of political interference. And we've been talking today, haven't we, about due diligence. Due diligence in banking. Well, the Community Reinvestment Act actually stopped banks carrying out due diligence. It was illegal to actually inquire of a borrower whether he could or could not repay the loan. And that's when you saw the invention of subprime mortgages, which never existed before. So it was political interference in the market which caused the subprime crisis. And if you add to that the bubble in the property market was created by criminal fraudulent central bankers printing money and artificially restraining interest rates, as central banks are still doing now. The Fed is still doing it, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, they're all at it, counterfeiting money. So we're lending money now at a far too cheap a rate, and we just print more money, and we're going to have another bubble, and we're going to do the whole thing all over again. And may I just close with just one thing, because something you don't understand clearly. If you can't foreclose on a mortgage, nobody will give you a mortgage. That's how the market works. Leave it to the market, caveat emptor, and let people get on with it without interference from politicians who, frankly, do not know what they are talking about.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bloom, in 1 minute.
Well, Mr. President, I'm minded actually to quote the great American philosopher Murray Rothbard here, that the state is an institution of theft writ large. Tax is just about a system where politicians and bureaucrats steal money from their citizens to squander in the most disgraceful manner. This place is no exception. Fascinatingly, and I really don't know how you manage to keep a straight face when you're talking about tax evasion, the whole Commission and the Commission bureaucracy avoid their taxes. You don't pay taxes like citizens pay taxes. You have all sorts of special deals, composite tax rates, high tax thresholds, non-contributory pension schemes. You are the biggest tax avoiders in Europe, and here you sit pontificating. Well, the message is getting home to the people of the European Union. You're going to find that Eurosceptics are coming back in June in ever greater numbers. And I can tell you worse, as the people get your number, it won't be long before they storm this chamber and they hang you, and they'll be right.
We live in a world of illusions. We see something, yet it doesn't exist. We breathe life, yet we aren't.